Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is the Vulgar Marxist. And though I do still have a slight sore throat due to a cold snap in the area I live, I am having a wonderful evening. I am having a truly fantastic and amazing weekend. And the reason for this is entirely due to some of the most virulent and hate-filled feminists ever seen. Now, for the last 10 years, I have advocated over and over and over and over on forum after forum and platform after platform that jobs were necessarily zero-sum, that the nuclear family was a direct and immediate product of the laboring class trying to not starve and freeze to death, and that a capitalist economy could not functionally produce enough jobs for everyone, because the instant it did, it would have to pay garbage collectors and sewage maintenance workers $100 an hour just to get them to show up to their jobs. And on every one of these platforms, I've had feminists stampede against me screaming, yes it can, there's magical jobs for everyone, and offer not a shred of evidence to support such a claim. Which brings us to a debate that is going to occur shortly. Oh my, I don't even have words here. Thank you, profoundly and profusely radical feminism, for flatly conceding every single thing I have just said. Is there any way to ask that question without openly and unfetteredly conceding that jobs are necessarily zero-sum? The rest follows from there. And they even go into detail. They even go into expounding detail about how jobs are zero-sum. That every job a woman takes is a man who is unemployed and unemployable. And I would like to go into detail here in case there is any confusion as to why this logically follows. Let us suppose the break-even point is 50% of the population. It might be more, it might be less. It really isn't relevant to the point. Now, let us also assume, contrary to the radical feminists, that I guarantee you will make this point amply clear at the debate, and yes, I will reply to that debate if I'm able to get my hands on a copy. But let's begin with the assumption that all human lives are equally valuable. Now, if jobs are available to only half of the laboring class, then only half of the laboring class has access to means of subsistence. That is, only half of the population is able to eat food, wear clothes, and sleep in a heated shelter under their own labor. The other half must either be provided with shelter, food, and clothing, or they shall unquestionably freeze and starve to death, as there are not enough jobs for them to secure shelter, food, and clothing upon their own effort. Now, certainly, no one who is reasonably serious expects the capitalists to provide the shelter, food, and clothing. They're loath enough to pay their people who are actually producing things for them wages. They certainly aren't going to pay people who aren't producing anything wages. Even economists repeatedly explaining the concept of circular capital flows, that is, that the workers are their own consumers, and if the capitalists expect to have anyone to sell products to, they have to pay a reasonable wage, has not gotten the capitalists to understand this concept. They continue to debase wages and react with shocked horror when their profits fall because they are no longer making the same sales figures. The capitalists genuinely do not believe that the workers have any relation to the economy in any way other than to drain away their profits by demanding the wages necessary to live. So, if the half of the population that is not and cannot be employed is not provisioned by the half of the population that is employed, they will again, I repeat, freeze and starve to death. The moral action in this situation is obvious. Those with jobs are required to shelter, feed, and clothe those who have no jobs. And again, this isn't some form of lechery or debauchery or mooching or anything like that. I repeat, the workers are their own consumers. If half the population starves and freezes to death, then half the workforce loses their jobs, and this cycle will repeat endlessly until no labor force of any kind exists. Now, while the more cynical among us might possibly believe that this is in fact the goal of the capitalist to simply starve workers out of existence, certainly I cannot believe that it is the goal of individuals like Miss Bindle, who lionize the feminism that they should in fact actively desire the overwhelming majority of women to die in gutters. So we must safely assume that Miss Bindle is either grotesquely unaware of the results of her proposal, or simply doesn't care about women as much as she claims to. But that aside, let's return to the topic. One way or another, those with jobs must feed those without jobs. Now, prior in US history, we called these nuclear families. That is, the half of the population who happened to be born with a penis was required to go to a job, while the half of the population that happened to have been born with a vagina was socially discouraged from having paid work. They still worked, and technically they were paid at $13.55 an hour, if my recollection serves. Yes, housework is paid. The value of the shelter, food, and clothing you receive from your partner is your compensation. But that said, half the population went to work, half the population stayed home, and everyone got to eat food until feminists decided that, not starving and freezing other people to death was somehow a form of oppression. I don't get how that follows, but okay, cool. Being denied the ability to exploit others is a form of oppression. Awesome. I'm sure the capitalists will be very, very proud. That said, there is another way to guarantee shelter, food, and clothing to all, and that is to literally guarantee shelter, food, and clothing to all, regardless of whether they work or not. This is called a universal basic income. And this, too, the feminists are railing against on what I have to say are some of the most absurd and spurious grounds I've ever heard. Now, before we proceed, I have used a text-to-voice program for this article because I personally cannot read an article like this without making the author sound like a raving idiot, which to me they do sound like. So in order to present the best case possible, I am using text-to-speech for their reading.
In the spring of 1968, a full-page letter addressed to Congress appeared in the Sunday edition of the New York Times, written by 5 prominent liberal economists. The letter's chief author, John Kenneth Galbraith, argued that a country as wealthy as the United States should, for reasons both ethical and financial, give everybody the assurance of a basic income. Having observed that the free market tends to constrain freedom for most, Galbraith advocated for a national system of income guarantees and supplements, that is, payments that would ensure the poorest Americans could still purchase basic needs like food, water, and shelter. What an idea! The letter was co-signed by 1,200 of Galbraith's fellow professional economists.
One of the things I have noted in my time online is that when someone wishes to shove a knife into an argument, they will first begin by presenting it in the most reasonable and neutral manner imaginable. Now, before we proceed, I have cut huge chunks out of this article because the author almost immediately goes off onto conspiracy theory tangents, speculations about the interests and desires of the elite, and various other ad hominems and non sequiturs in order to attack the idea of a UBI. I'll go into her claims as best I can, but I would like to give you a brief sample of exactly how bad this article is. If you wish to read the entire thing, the link is obviously in the screen cap. Please feel free. It's a tour de force in garbage.
Momentum for universal basic income is growing, the billionaire Richard Branson concluded in a recent podcast blog post. Titled Experimenting with Universal Basic Income, Branson's native advertisement frames itself around his meeting with the elders, a bafflingly real super team of global leaders whose ranks include Kofi Annan, Jimmy Carter, and the ghost of Nelson Mandela.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, according to this article, our world is being led by a cabal of elites who apparently can commune with the dead via seance.
At the elders' remote headquarters in Finland, Branson learns of the nascent EOB programs being implemented in cities across the Western world, as well as the ethical paragons who have already voiced support for basic income programs. Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and senior Vatican members are among those who have raised the idea too. Add to that list of illustrious names the likes of Slack's Stuart Butterfield, Y Combinator's Sam Altman, and failed New Republic steward Chris Hughes, and the support for UB among Silicon Valley's billionaire class becomes distressingly widespread.
You will note the use of her word distressingly there. Why is it distressing? Why do I care? Anyone familiar with dialectics or Marxist theory at all should understand that if two people function from entirely opposing worldviews, they are going to be able to look at exactly the same series of circumstances and reach diametrically opposite conclusions. If I hold that markets cannot set prices efficiently and a capitalist hold that markets can set prices efficiently, then I am going to see market collapses as the result of wide-scale price inefficiencies, whereas the capitalist will see them as a correction. Conversely, in this case, if I look at UBI and see a way for the workers to escape having to sell their labor, and a capitalist looks at the UBI and sees a way to guarantee future profits, that doesn't necessarily mean the capitalist is correct. You could be entirely wrong, and in fact, I am correct. But the author doesn't even take this into consideration.
Today's basic income programs are often pitched by the elite as measures to offset income losses from automation, yet their greatest advocates are the principal drivers and profiteers of the phenomenon. Why, 50 years after economists like Galbraith foresaw the divergence of productivity and wage growth, has this populist concept taken sudden hold of the elite? What has disrupted the disruptors?
The author attempts to string two things together here that are based entirely on a capitalist construction. What the heck does automation have to do with the stagnation of wages? No, I'm serious. Look at the graph. If we were seeing automation displacing workers, we would be seeing labor force collapsing at the same rate that wages are collapsing. Jobs are demand, labor is the supply. If demand is falling, both quantity and price will fall at the same rate. The only reason you would see price fall while quantity increases is if demand is constant.
There will soon come a time, a bright, new future that doubles as a second dark age, when a majority of the world economy's jobs will be either fully automated or altogether eliminated. Neither high-skilled nor low-skilled work will be spared from obliteration. Touchscreen stations will completely replace retail cashiers, as multi-limbed robotic hydras perform brain surgeries. As the machines occupy a never greater slice of the economy, the capital that they generate will flow into fewer and fewer pockets, namely, into those of the tech moguls currently advocating for a universal basic income.
There is an intellectual exercise I like to engage when considering an argument by someone I would view as an opponent. I begin by taking absolutely everything they say and assuming it is true. Now, I'm going to flip back and forth between a couple of graphs during this section because I want you to see the relationship between them. As wealth concentrates in fewer and fewer hands, the rate of growth of the economy slows and slows and slows and slows. Why would that be? Why would the economy stagnate as the rich get richer? Because, quite obviously, Bill Gates is not going to eat as many hamburgers as all of the employees of Ford Motor Companies do. Because Mark Zuckerberg is never going to drive as many cars as the entirety of the population of Manhattan does. Because Elon Musk is never going to use as much deodorant or wear as many shirts as all of the people he displaces will ever use.
For them, exploratory UBI programs aren't practice runs for a proto-socialism that could counteract the woes of late capitalism. Rather, they are beta tests for deceptive public policy that could sustain late capitalism forever. The aim is pacification, not liberation. A universal basic income is, in the most cynical sense, a subtle kind of doomsday prep for the tech billionaire, a means to diffuse the revolutionary potential of the working class by supplying them with the absolute bare minimum, just enough to keep them almost happy.
Now, I am going to make a large assumption here. I have no evidence for it, and I will freely and openly concede I do not have enough evidence to state this as a fact. However, there is an apparent relationship between the collapse of wages, which fell approximately 8%, the increase of the wealth of the few, which rose approximately 8%, and the stagnation of the economy, which slowed down approximately 7%. Now, I'm going to do some back-of-the-envelope numbers here. A UBI would be about $16,000 per person for 300 million Americans or so. That comes to about $4.8 trillion, or about, I think, 30-something% of GDP. Now, at the present time, the American labor force is paid, I think, 44% of GDP in wages, and the collapse from 52 to 44% has resulted in the near total stagnation of our economy. What would happen to the economy if wages fell another 12%?
Just as the ostensible simplicity of UBI obscures its harmful latent potential, the concept's promised universality would likely be anything but. Presumably, eligibility for a universal basic income program would require official citizenship status, a distinction denied to tens of millions of undocumented immigrants, many of them poor, in the United States and abroad. Without concomitant changes to immigration legislation and policy, UBI could worsen the disadvantages that undocumented immigrants already face, enriching and empowering those with whom they already compete for jobs, housing, and social services.
There are, as best I am able to research, approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. This person is arguing that 300 million people should have their livelihood held hostage until 11 million people are granted a status they theoretically would be able to legitimately apply for after a socialist revolution has already occurred. 300 million people should starve, so 11 million people can get a piece of paper. That's a little asinine. But further, her arguments make no sense. Again, I repeat, labor is a supply. If half of workers quit their jobs because they now have the option of living without having to work, it stands to reason that the 11 million people who are undocumented would not only have access to new jobs, but likely see a substantive pay raise. How does this not immediately follow? I literally do not understand.
No one can say where, exactly, the dividing line would fall, but it's safe to assume that felons, who cannot vote under present law, would, alongside everyone else deemed unworthy, find themselves on the outside looking in. Meanwhile, those citizens lucky enough to gain access to the program would be submitting to governmental surveillance of untold invasiveness, where everything from purchase histories to biometric data could be used to determine eligibility.
What did I tell you about the conspiracy theories? I mean, what is this except scaremongering and ad hominem at this point? Biometric data? Purchase histories? The most conservative states in America do not do those things for existing social welfare programs like food stamps. They don't do it for housing vouchers. They don't do it for anything. I mean, Jesus Christ, biometric data, where is this coming from? I cannot imagine any government that would implement a UBI but tie it to things like biometric data and purchase histories. That is literally far-fetched, out there, totally unheard of or unproposed scaremongering. Just utter and pure scaremongering.
The American government has an extensive history of denying its most vulnerable citizens access to the programs they need the most, so why would such a generous, plainly redistributive program be any exception? In all likelihood, a bill proposing a universal basic income would only pass as hodgepodge legislation, a bundle of counterpast policies that undercuts the original purpose it was drafted to serve, a UB that bypasses the destitute to deliver funds to those who need them least.
What the hell is this person even talking about? Yes, modern conservative administrations engage in wide-scale nepotism and corruption, but for the period of time when our nation was most prosperous, the government very explicitly worked to deliver public benefits to the overwhelming majority of the public. I mean, there are two ways I can interpret this. Either she earnestly believes that the majority of people are not worthy of these benefits, in which case I would ask how precisely she's making that determination, or she is almost completely and totally ignorant of the history of progressive governance in this nation.
This is all a way of saying that the specifics of a universal basic income system cannot be left to the billionaire entrepreneurs and millionaire politicians, Republican and Democrat, whose destructive influence necessitated a UB in the first place. The lower-class people who stand to benefit from a universal basic income should be the primary, if not sole, architects of the program.
You mean the lower-class people who have no representatives in Congress, no ability to put legislation before Congress, no ability to pass legislation directly via public referendum, should magically poof into existence a legislative framework that will likely comprise hundreds if not thousands of pages? How the hell is that supposed to happen? I'm serious. How the hell do you think that's going to happen? We don't have referendum ballots in this nation. We certainly don't have the ability to force them onto a Congress that has no interest in having them. The only way for an UBI program to occur prior to a revolution is for the legislature of the United States to pass it. So again, we are seeing her saying we cannot have an UBI until after the revolution has already occurred, and the revolution is not permitted to occur, ostensibly based on other arguments, until after feminists have every single thing they want. This person is literally holding the subsistence of millions of people hostage to whatever random thing they come up with next.
The great tragedy of the universal income debate is that the program could be implemented tomorrow and, despite all the possible complications outlined above, millions of lives would be radically, gloriously improved. If, for instance, 2018's proposed $700 billion budget for military spending were distributed to the 45 million Americans living under the federal poverty line. Each individual would receive an outlay of more than $15,500. For a low-income family of 4, their annual income would nearly quadruple overnight.
So, having just inveined against a partial or limited program, she immediately proposes a partial and limited program. The point of a universal basic income is that it is universal. This isn't a beloved and magical handout to those in need. This is a system of ensuring the workers, if they so choose, do not have to sell their labor if it is not in their narrow self-interest to do so. Offering a financial benefit to only the very lowest strata of workers will allow that strata to quit their jobs, but that will not impact wages overall. I mean, again, I'm not even going to bother putting the graph back up here. We can very clearly observe that increases in the minimum wage have not benefited median income at all. They've had almost no impact on median income, which has slid into the gutter for 50-odd years. So what possible effect does she think handing the lowest wage workers a cash benefit is going to have on 90% of everybody else? The answer is none. This is not someone who is interested in helping workers. This is not someone who is interested in helping the median class. She certainly is not interested in insulating people against her own prediction of wide-scale destitution due to automation. I mean, the proposal she just made would be completely useless in that event. Absolutely and utterly useless. And yet she makes it anyway. Why? This is merely a repetition of the welfare programs of the 1970s and 80s that were a debacle, that were an absolute disaster precisely because the workers, one, had no option of quitting, the program was demonized, it was underfunded. We are repeating the errors of the past. For what? Nothing. The purpose of a UBI is and must be allowing the workers to quit their jobs if it is not in their narrow self-interest to continue selling their labor at the available price. The person speaking here either does not comprehend that or is terrified of that outcome. I will not speculate as to which. Now, I was going to add a second part to this video, or rather include another clip, but this video is already at 30 minutes and it's almost midnight on the 31st, so I really do need to get it posted this month before, April the 1st. It's not a joke, I'm quite serious. But I am going to make a second part in which I cover a discussion between Paul Krugman and Ezra Klein that is, if possible, even worse than the article you just listened to. If for no other reason than these two should have some clue what the hell they're talking about.